Listen closely. Can you hear it? The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer striking hot metal. The low murmur of voices growing steadily as the first light of dawn touches the cobblestones. Inhale deeply, that sharp, smoky scent of wood fires mingling with the rich, earthy aroma of freshly tanned leather, and the surprising sweetness of honey cakes wafting from a baker's stall. Open your eyes to a world alive with motion merchants unfurling colorful cloths, farmers arranging baskets of autumn apples, children darting through the crowd, their laughter swallowed by the swelling noise of commerce and community. This is not just a marketplace. It was the beating heart of medieval life, a stage where fortunes were made, news traveled faster than any horse, and the very fabric of society was woven day by day. We often picture these scenes in broad strokes: a crowded square, people bartering, the occasional jester entertaining the masses. But hidden within that vibrant chaos are countless untold stories, intricate systems of trust and trade, and social codes that dictated everything from where you stood to who you could speak with. What if I told you that the medieval market was far more than just a place to buy bread or a new pot? It was a living, breathing organism, a crossroads of cultures, a hotbed of innovation, and sometimes a powder keg of tension and intrigue. Behind the cheerful shouts of vendors and the glitter of coins changing hands lay complex networks of regulation, ritual, and raw human ambition. Today, we're stepping into that world together. We'll walk these cobblestone lanes not as observers, but as explorers uncovering how these markets really functioned, who held the power, what secrets lay behind the stalls, and why these gatherings were so much more than simple shopping trips. This is where history truly comes alive, in the hands of a spice trader weighing precious saffron, in the wary eyes of a tax collector, in the hopeful smile of a young apprentice dreaming of a better life. You're about to discover how the medieval market shaped economies, sparked revolutions, connected distant worlds, and ultimately laid the groundwork for the modern world we know today. So come with me, let's lose ourselves in the crowd and uncover the astonishing truth behind one of history's greatest social experiments. To truly grasp its significance, we must first abandon our modern idea of a store. This was not a weekly errand. It was the town's lifeblood, its central nervous system. Its very existence was a privilege, granted by a formal royal charter or the explicit permission of the local lord. This document was far more than a business license. It was a declaration of importance, a legal force field that transformed a random field into a sanctioned arena for trade, offering protection, regulating disputes, and drawing people from miles around under its guarantee of order. Without that charter, you just had a gathering. With it, you had an institution. And what an institution it was. Imagine it as the internet, the newspaper, the stock exchange, and the town square, all rolled into one bustling, noisy, incredibly smelly experience. This was where information traveled at the speed of human conversation. A farmer from a distant village might bring whispers of a bad harvest 2 counties over, causing grain prices to shift before noon. A traveling merchant, his clothes smelling of salt and foreign spices, could share news of political upheaval or a distant war, making the world feel both terrifyingly large and intimately connected. Courts were held here, proclamations read aloud, and marriages announced. It was the original social media feed, and everyone was tuned in. But beyond commerce and news, the market was the glue of the community. It was the one place where virtually every layer of medieval society intersected, a rare and controlled social leveler. The Lord Steward might be haggling with a free peasant over the price of a goose. The local priest would be purchasing wax for church candles beside a group of rowdy apprentices enjoying their day off. For many, especially women, it was a sanctioned avenue for social freedom and economic agency. A brewer's wife could run the ale stall, earning her own coin and her own reputation, operating within a sphere of relative independence she might find nowhere else. This constant, sanctioned mixing was vital. It reinforced social hierarchies even as it temporarily softened them, creating a shared identity. You weren't just someone from the village, you were part of the market crowd. You shared in its collective mood, its gossip, its triumphs and anxieties. The success of the market day meant prosperity for the entire community. A bad one could spell hardship for months. Its rhythm dictated the rhythm of life itself, a weekly pulse that gave structure to existence, making it so much more than a place to shop. It was the beating heart of the medieval world. Picture the quiet of a Tuesday in a small village, 3 days before the market. The air is still, punctuated only by the rhythmic sound of a hoe in a field or the steady clack of a loom from a cottage window. Life moves to the slow, patient tempo of agricultural routine. But beneath this surface calm, a subtle undercurrent of anticipation begins to stir. The market's approach is a gravitational pull, slowly drawing energy and attention from the surrounding countryside, reshaping the priorities of every household. For the village baker, this meant calculating how many extra loaves he could produce without risking a shortage of flour. He might start by mixing a larger batch of sourdough starter, feeding it more generously, knowing it would need to be strong and active by Friday morning. His wife would begin polishing their wooden trays and checking their stock of cloths to keep the bread clean and presentable. Their children would be tasked with gathering extra kindling to keep the oven fires burning hot and long through the night before the market, a night where sleep would be a scarce commodity. Meanwhile, a freeholder with a small patch of land would walk his fields with a more critical eye, deciding which vegetables were perfectly ripe for picking come Thursday evening leafy greens that would wilt if harvested too early, or root vegetables that needed a final brush of soil to make them gleam. His wife and daughters would be inspecting their carefully preserved stores, pots of honey, jars of pickled eggs, bundles of dried herbs, and perhaps the season's first wheels of hard cheese. Each item was assessed not just for quality, but for its potential to fetch a good price, to be transformed from a product of their labor into coveted coin. For the traveling merchants and specialized craftspeople, the preparation was a logistical feat. The potter, working in his workshop a few miles away, would be loading his robust cart with carefully nested wares cups, bowls and pitchers, each padded with straw to survive the jostling journey. The cloth merchant would be unrolling bolts of fabric, checking for any flaws or travel stains, making mental notes of which colors and patterns had been most requested the last time he was in this particular town. These were the professionals, and their entire livelihood depended on the success of this one day. By Thursday, the quiet village rhythm had been entirely replaced by a focused hum of activity. The roads, usually empty save for the occasional ox cart, began to show signs of life as the first travelers appeared. You might see a farmer driving a small herd of squealing piglets, their destiny the livestock pen. A tinker, his cart clattering with the sound of pots and pans, would make his slow way into town, seeking a good spot to set up his mobile repair shop. The air itself began to change, carrying the scent of wood smoke from more fires and the distinct smell of animals being driven towards their temporary enclosures. As dusk fell on Thursday, the atmosphere crackled with a nervous, excited energy. Homes were filled with the final touches, eggs were packed into baskets with meticulous care, butter was patted into decorative shapes, and ale was tasted one last time for quality. In the Lord's Hall, his stewards would be reviewing the market regulations, ensuring the measuring rods and weight scales were true and accurate, ready to enforce the laws that kept trade fair. The town's innkeeper was airing out rooms and rolling out extra barrels, anticipating a night filled with the laughter and boasts of arriving merchants. This crescendo of preparation culminated in a night of little sleep. Well before the first hint of dawn on Friday, the silence would be broken by the sounds of movement, the lowing of an ox being harnessed, the quiet murmur of families gathering their goods, the creak of carts rolling through the darkness. They moved by lantern light, a procession of shadows all flowing toward the same destination, the marketplace. Each person carried with them not just their goods, but their hopes for prosperity, their need for community, and their readiness to play a part in the weekly miracle that was about to unfold. Then, in the deep blue stillness just before sunrise, a single sound would cut through the low hum of anticipation, the clear, commanding ring of a handbell. All other noises would momentarily hush. Every head, from the weary farmer adjusting his produce to the wealthy merchant straightening his fur-trimmed cloak, would turn toward the source. There, standing on a raised platform or perhaps the steps of the market cross, was the town crier, the master of ceremonies for the day. Resplendent in his official livery, often a brightly colored tabard bearing the Lord's coat of arms, he was the living symbol of authority and order. That bell was not a request for attention. It was a demand, and it was always obeyed. His voice, trained to carry over crowds without strain, would then boom across the square. Oyez, 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 he would cry, an old Norman French call meaning, hear ye. This formal proclamation signaled the official commencement of the market, transforming the anxious gathering into a sanctioned event operating under the protection and law of the crown or local lord. This ceremony was absolutely crucial. It drew a clear, audible line between the informal hustle of setup and the regulated, serious business of trade. It reminded everyone present that they were now participants in a legal framework, with rights certainly, but also with very clear responsibilities. The crier would then begin to read aloud the market's rules and regulations, a ritual that served as the day's constitution. He would declare the official measures: the length of the ell for cloth, the volume of the bushel for grain, the weight of the stone for wool. He would announce the fixed prices for essential commodities like bread and ale, a measure designed to prevent profiteering and ensure even the poorest could afford basic sustenance. Any bans would be stated, perhaps on the sale of certain goods, or on the drawing of weapons within the market precinct. He might also proclaim any special tolls or taxes due to the Lord, leaving no one in any doubt about the cost of doing business that day. Following the rules, the crier often served as the town's news anchor. He would share important announcements, the date of the next court session, a declaration from a visiting noble, or a warning about wanted criminals in the vicinity. This ensured that vital information reached the entire community at once, from the highest to the lowest, making the market the central hub for official discourse. It was a powerful demonstration of how information was controlled and disseminated, flowing from the top down in a very public, yet highly formalized, manner. The ceremony often reached its visual climax with the symbolic unfurling of banners. The Lord's standard would be raised high above the market cross or a central flagpole, flapping in the morning breeze. This was more than decoration. It was a statement of ownership and protection. To trade under that banner meant you were under the Lord's peace. It offered a guarantee against violence and theft, promising that disputes would be adjudicated fairly and that the market's laws would be enforced by his stewards and bailiffs. For the people, that banner was a promise of safety. For the Lord, it was a bold advertisement of his power and his commitment to justice, which in turn encouraged more people to attend, making his market more successful and lucrative. With the final shout of "God save the King," or a similar benediction, the crier would ring his bell one last time and step down. And in that instant, the frozen crowd would erupt into motion and sound. The ceremonial silence shattered into the vibrant chaos of commerce. But it was a chaos now bounded by law, monitored by authority, and sanctified by tradition. That opening ritual was the key that unlocked the entire event, ensuring that what followed was not anarchy, but a complex, thriving, and orderly dance of medieval economics and social exchange. With the final peal of the bell still hanging in the crisp morning air, the scene exploded into a frantic, beautiful chaos of creation. The solemnity of the ceremony gave way to the raw, physical energy of hundreds of people, all striving to build their small piece of the market literally from the ground up. This was the merchant's mad dash, a race against the rising sun to be ready for the first wave of customers. Picture the cacophony. The air, once filled with the crier's pronouncements, was now thick with the groan of wooden axles, the sharp whinny of horses being unhitched from heavy carts, and the shouted instructions of a cloth merchant to his apprentice. The ground, still damp with dew, churned into mud under the constant trample of feet and hooves. For these traders, time was not just money, it was prime positioning, the chance to catch a buyer's eye before their competitor 3 stalls down. The transformation of the empty square was a marvel of medieval efficiency. From the backs of wagons and the sides of pack mules came a seemingly endless flow of poles, ropes, and heavy rolls of waxed canvas. Teams of 2 or 3 people worked in practiced unison, their movements a well-rehearsed dance. One would drive the sharpened end of a timber post into the earth with a heavy mallet, the thump echoing solidly, while another swiftly lashed crossbeams into place with expert knots. Over this skeleton, they would drape the canvas, pulling it taut to create a temporary roof and walls, a shield against both the harsh sun and the occasional sudden downpour. Each stall began to reflect the personality and wares of its owner even before a single item was displayed. The baker's space was invariably closest to the approach roads, using the irresistible aroma of his fresh bread as a siren call to draw people deeper into the market. You'd see him carefully transferring his precious loaves from covered baskets onto a long, scrubbed wooden table, arranging them in proud rows. Nearby, the apothecary performed a more delicate ritual, unpacking small, carved wooden boxes and glass phials with utmost care, lining them up like soldiers on a velvet cloth to signal the value and mystery of his goods. The livestock traders faced the noisiest and most physically demanding setup. Driving nervous sheep or squealing piglets into temporary pens made of lashed-together hurdles was a test of patience and strength, a noisy ballet of bleats, brays, and shouted commands. The air around them quickly took on the distinct, pungent smell of animals, hay, and manure, a stark contrast to the sweet spices wafting from the next aisle. And everywhere there was the art of the display. This was where commerce met theatre. A potter wouldn't just line up his bowls, he would build pyramids of them, demonstrating their perfect uniformity and stability. A silversmith would arrange his finest pieces on a tiered stand covered in dark cloth, ensuring they caught the first rays of the morning sun. Farmers' wives arranged their eggs in intricate spirals within baskets, and their butter was stamped with decorative patterns that acted as a brand. For the next several hours, this hastily constructed village of commerce would be their home, their factory, and their stage, all built from scratch before most of their customers had even finished their breakfast. This organized chaos was anything but random. If you could rise above the bustling crowd and look down, you would see the marketplace not as a jumbled mess, but as a carefully designed ecosystem, a living map where social status, practicality, and economic power dictated every single placement. The layout was a silent language, understood by everyone from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest shopper. And moving through its zones meant traveling through the entire spectrum of medieval life. At the very heart of the action, physically and symbolically, stood the most permanent and prestigious structure, the cloth hall or guild hall. Often a grand stone building with a vaulted roof and wide arches, this was the domain of the elite. Inside, under the cool, dim light, the wealthiest merchants conducted their high-value trades. Here you wouldn't find shouted haggling. Business was done in measured tones, with bolts of the finest Flemish wool, shimmering Italian silks, and expensive dyes like madder and woad changing hand. The cloth hall was a statement of permanence and prosperity, a physical manifestation of the town's economic muscle. Its central location wasn't just for show. It placed the most valuable goods and the most important merchants squarely under the watchful eyes of the market officials, and provided the greatest protection from both the elements and potential thieves. Radiating out from this powerful core were the main thoroughfares, the prime real estate for established local vendors and essential food sellers. The baker, the brewer, the cheesemonger, and the butchers who had permanent shops in the town would also set up their stalls along these busy arteries. Their positioning was strategic genius. Every person entering the market had to flow past them, lured by the smell of fresh bread and roasted meats, the visual appeal of golden wheels of cheese, and the promise of a cool tankard of ale. These staples were the engine of the market, the goods everyone needed, and their prime location ensured a constant stream of customers from opening bell to closing time. As you moved further from the center, the atmosphere and the wares began to shift. The next ring was often dedicated to the craftspeople and manufacturers. The potters with their stacks of utilitarian bowls and jugs, the blacksmiths showcasing nails, hinges, and simple tools, the cobblers offering repairs and new shoes, and the basket weavers with their intricate creation. Their stalls were slightly less glamorous, often simpler constructions, but they represented the backbone of local industry. The goods here were durable, necessary, and the result of specialized skills, attracting buyers who needed a new pot or a hinge for their door, not a luxury import. Pushed to the very outer edges of the square, or even into a field just beyond, was the livestock section. This zoning was purely practical. The constant noise, the overwhelming smell, and the sheer mess created by herds of sheep, squealing pigs, and lowing cattle made them terrible neighbors for a spice merchant or a linen seller. The livestock area was a world unto itself, a muddy arena where serious business was conducted. Here, farmers and professional drovers assessed animals with a critical eye, checking teeth, feeling haunches, and engaging in the rapid-fire, coded language of livestock bargaining. This was where a family's wealth, often walking on four hooves, was converted into cash, a transaction that required space, privacy, and a tolerance for chaos. And then, truly on the fringes, occupying the spaces between stalls, at the crossroads just outside the official boundary, were the entertainers, the beggars, and the fringe traders. This was the unpredictable, vibrant underbelly of the market. A juggler or a musician would set up where the crowd was thickest, hoping coins would be tossed into a hat for providing a moment of joy. A tooth puller or a quack doctor might operate from the back of a cart, offering miraculous cures with dramatic flair. Pickpockets and prostitutes also worked these crowded peripheries, exploiting the distractions of the crowd. This outer ring had its own economy, one based on charity, spectacle, and sometimes deception. A necessary and accepted part of the market's complex social fabric. Now, with this vibrant economic machine humming all around them, let's talk about the fuel that made it run. Money, but forget the simple idea of pulling out a wallet. The medieval marketplace was a symphony of different payment methods, a chaotic yet functional mix of coin, commodities, and pure negotiation that would baffle a modern cashier. The most prestigious form of payment was, of course, coin. But this wasn't a simple system of a single national currency. The jingle in a merchant's pouch was often a confusing international collection. You might find English silver pennies rubbing shoulders with heavy Byzantine gold bezants, thick Flemish groats, and even ancient Roman coins that had remained in circulation for centuries. The value of these coins wasn't in what was stamped on their face, but in the actual weight and purity of their precious metal. This is where a crucial, trusted figure entered the scene, the money changer or assayer. Stationed at a small table near the center of the market, often under the watchful eye of the Lord's officials, he was the human calculator of the medieval economy. With a small, precision balance scale, a set of known good weights, and a touchstone to test the softness of gold, he would verify the true worth of every foreign and suspect coin. For this essential service, he took a small cut, making him one of the most indispensable and wealthy men in the square. For the vast majority of common people, however, coins were a rare luxury. Their entire lives might operate on what economists call commodity money. This meant that the value of everyday goods was often measured against a stable, widely accepted staple, most commonly grain. A peasant might arrive at the market not with a purse of silver, but with a dozen eggs, a basket of apples, or a carefully woven length of cloth. The value of these items wasn't set in stone. It was mentally calculated against an imagined measure of barley or wheat. A skilled potter knew his large cooking pot was worth, say, 2 bushels of grain. A farmer's wife understood that her bundle of wool might trade for 1 bushel. This system required an encyclopedic knowledge of relative values that everyone just carried in their heads, a shared economic language that kept local trade flowing smoothly even in the near-total absence of official coinage. And then there was the purest and oldest form of trade, direct barter. This wasn't just a simple swap. It was a complex social dance of perceived value and immediate need. That farmer with the eggs might not need a new pot, but the potter's apprentice might be hungry. So a deal is struck: 6 eggs for a small, slightly cracked cup. A woman with a fine bolt of homespun linen might covet the silversmith's simple brooch, but the silversmith has no need for more cloth. However, he mentions his wife has been wanting a new hen, and the woman's neighbor just happens to have some fine chickens. A 3-way, multi-good deal is slowly, carefully negotiated, with each party assessing the fairness not just of the objects, but of the relationships and future favors involved. This entire ecosystem was governed by one universal constant: the art of the haggle. Fixed prices were almost unheard of for anything beyond the most basic, law-regulated staples like bread. Every transaction began with a price that was intentionally inflated, an opening move in a ritualized game. The buyer would counter with an offer they knew was too low. What followed was a spirited back and forth, a performance filled with exaggerated sighs, dramatic declarations of poverty, heartfelt compliments about the goods, and subtle insults about their quality. This wasn't seen as rude. It was expected. It was how both parties proved they were not fools, that they understood the true value of things. A successful haggle concluded with both sides feeling they had won, or at least that they hadn't been cheated. It was the social glue of commerce, a way to build a momentary bond of trust between stranger and merchant, sealed not just with an exchange of goods, but with a shared participation in the market's oldest ritual. But amidst all this vibrant commerce and social negotiation, one couldn't forget the ever-present, sobering reminder of who was truly in charge. In a prime location, impossible to miss for anyone entering the market square, stood the town's instruments of justice, the stocks and the pillory. These were not hidden away. Their prominent placement was a deliberate piece of political theatre, a constant visual cue that the market's peace and the Lord's laws were not suggestions, but mandates enforced with public humiliation and physical discomfort. The stocks were a relatively simple, though deeply effective, device. Picture two heavy wooden planks, hinged together at one end. The lower plank was fixed to a sturdy post driven into the ground, while the upper could be lifted and locked into place. When secured, two semicircular holes in the planks clamped firmly around the ankles of the offender, leaving them sitting on the ground in a painfully exposed and immobile position. The pillory, its more intimidating cousin, was designed for greater humiliation. It operated on the same principle, but was built to restrain the head and hands, forcing the condemned to stand bent over, their neck and wrists locked in a wooden frame, their face presented to the crowd like a grotesque exhibit. The crimes that landed someone in these contraptions were specifically those that threatened the market's fragile ecosystem of trust. A baker convicted of selling underweight loaves, a serious offense when bread was life itself, might find himself locked in the stocks with the fraudulent loaf hung around his neck. A butcher caught putting a thumb on the scale to overcharge for meat could expect a similar fate, but the most severe wrath was reserved for the counterfeiter, the individual who undermined the very foundation of trade by debasing the currency. His punishment was often a prolonged session in the pillory, with the fake coins melted and poured over his hands, a permanent, scalding brand of his crime. The punishment, however, went far beyond the physical constraint. The true power of the stocks and pillory lay in the crowd's participation. Being locked in place made the offender a target for public judgment. They were utterly at the mercy of the community they had wronged. While some might simply endure jeers and mocking laughter, the experience often turned far uglier. Rotten vegetables, mud, animal dung, and even harder, more dangerous projectiles were hurled at the helpless individual. This wasn't merely sanctioned, it was encouraged. The crowd became an extension of the law, meting out a rough, immediate form of communal justice that reinforced social norms and served as a powerful, unforgettable deterrent for everyone else watching. For a society built on personal honor and reputation, this public shaming was a devastating sentence. A day in the stocks could ruin a tradesman's good name for years, destroying the hard-earned trust that was his most valuable asset. The spectacle was a grim but essential part of the market's rhythm, a brutal interlude that paused the cheerful haggling to deliver a stark lesson. The freedom to trade here was a privilege, and the price for breaking its sacred trust was a very public, very humiliating fall from grace. While the stocks served as a stark reminder of the market's laws, the true purpose of this carefully regulated chaos, from the Lord's perspective, was not just maintaining order, it was generating wealth. Every transaction, every shout of a vendor, every coin that changed hands, represented a potential stream of revenue flowing directly into the Lord's coffers. The market was, in essence, a brilliantly designed economic engine, and its primary fuel was a complex system of taxes, tolls, and tariffs meticulously enforced by his officials. The most fundamental of these was the stallage fee. Imagine a modern-day vendor renting a booth at a fair. The concept was exactly the same, but with the weight of feudal obligation behind it. The Lord, as the ultimate owner of the land, charged every single seller for the privilege of setting up their stall on his property. This fee was far from uniform. A prime spot in the central thoroughfare, with high foot traffic and visibility, commanded a premium price, much like a retail store on a busy main street today. A craftsman with a larger stall displaying expensive goods would pay more than a farmer's wife with a small basket of eggs on the periphery. These rents were often collected by the Lord's bailiff, a formidable figure who would move through the lanes with a scribe and a strongbox, his presence ensuring prompt payment from even the most reluctant merchant. But the Lord's reach extended beyond those who set up shop. He also taxed movement itself through a system of tolls. Anyone bringing goods into the town for sale, particularly outsiders who did not hold land from him and owed no other feudal dues, had to pay an entrance toll. This was often collected at a gate or a specific toll booth on the approach roads. A carter bringing in a load of wine from a distant vineyard, toll. A drover herding 20 sheep from the next county. A toll per head. These levies protected local producers from outside competition and ensured that the Lord profited from every bit of commerce that entered his domain, regardless of where the final sale occurred. It was a border control for economics, and the bailiff's men were its unwavering guards. Perhaps the most lucrative taxes were the levies on specific, high-value goods. Essential commodities like grain and flour were often subject to a mandatory toll, a percentage taken in kind rather than in coin. The Lord's officials might have the right to take a handful of grain from every bushel sold, or a measure from every sack of flour. This provided the castle with a direct supply of provisions, but the real treasure was in the luxury items, goods that were small, valuable, and in high demand. Think spices like pepper and saffron, expensive wine, fine silk, or high-quality weaponry, were taxed at a much higher rate. Their exotic nature and the vast distances they traveled made them status symbols, and the Lord taxed that desire heavily, knowing the wealthy would pay the inflated prices. The man tasked with overseeing this entire financial extraction was the Lord's bailiff. He was the chief executive of the market's economy, a figure of immense practical power. On market day, he was everywhere, a constant and calculating presence. He verified the accuracy of scales and measuring rods against the official standards kept in the Guildhall. He settled disputes over payments and stall boundaries. Most importantly, he and his assistants kept meticulous records on wax tablets or parchment rolls, noting every fee collected, every toll paid, and every levy taken. His efficiency directly determined the profitability of the entire event for his master. For the merchants and peasants, the bailiff was the face of the Lord's greed. For the Lord, he was the most valuable man in the fiefdom, the person who transformed the vibrant, chaotic energy of the market into the cold, hard wealth that sustained his power, his household, and his ambition. To truly step into this world, you must prepare to be overwhelmed. The first assault was always on the nose, a wall of scent so potent and complex, it would stop a modern person in their tracks. This was not a single smell, but a layered, ever-shifting tapestry of odors that told the story of everything and everyone present. The most immediate and base note was the thick, earthy pungency of animal dung and hay from the livestock pens. A sharp, organic smell that grounded the entire experience in the reality of an agricultural society. Woven through that was the smoky haze of countless wood fires, each contributing its own flavor from the type of wood burned: oak for the blacksmith's forge, fruitwood for the baker's oven. Then came the truly surprising layers. As you moved through the crowd, your nose would be ambushed by pockets of incredible fragrance. One moment, you'd catch the rich, savory scent of a whole side of beef or pork turning on a spit, its fat dripping and sizzling onto the coals below. A smell of immediate, primal hunger. The very next breath might bring the almost unbelievable sweetness of honey cakes, frying in oil or spiced wine, simmering in a large pot. A tantalizing promise of luxury. But the most astonishing aromas came from the spice merchant's stall. Here, in a small space, was the scent of the entire known world, the sharp, piercing heat of black pepper, the exotic, bittersweet perfume of cinnamon, the golden, hay-like scent of saffron, each spice a tiny, fragrant piece of geography that had traveled thousands of miles to titillate the senses and empty the purses of the wealthy. And underpinning it all was the undeniable, musky scent of humanity itself, of wool cloaks damp with rain or sweat, of leather worn for years, of bodies that knew only occasional bathing. This wasn't a sign of filth to them. It was simply the background scent of life, a testament to hard work and long journeys. If the smells were a layered story, the sounds were a relentless, roaring symphony with no conductor and no silence. The bass line, the constant drone you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears, was the animal chorus. It was a chaotic barnyard orchestra, the panicked, high-pitched bleating of sheep being separated for sale, the deep, anxious lowing of cattle, the indignant squeals of piglets, and the frantic clucking of chickens in cramped wicker cages. This provided a non-stop soundtrack of life and stress. Soaring above this animal din were the human voices, engaged in the great ritual of commerce. This was not a quiet murmur but a competitive performance. Each vendor was a soloist, trying to outdo his neighbor. Their cries were rhythmic, musical, and designed to pierce through the noise. "Hot pies, come get your hot pies," a baker would bellow, his voice cracking with the effort. "Fine linens from Ghent, don't be fooled by cheap imitations." A cloth merchant would sing out, his tone dripping with practiced superiority. "Sharp knives, I'll put an edge on your blade." A cutler would shout, clanging a piece of metal to prove his point. The air was thick with these overlapping calls, a verbal marketplace where volume and charm were directly linked to profit. And weaving through this human and animal cacophony were the industrial sounds of creation and repair. From a side lane, you'd hear the distinctive, percussive clang, clang, clang of a blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron on an anvil, a sound that meant strength and utility. The rhythmic tap, tap, tapping of a cobbler repairing a shoe provided a softer counterpoint. From the edge of the square, a minstrel or a troupe of musicians might be playing a lively tune on a pipe and tabor, their melody sometimes swallowed by the noise, sometimes rising above it to provide a few seconds of joyous escape, hoping their art would earn them a few coins tossed into a hat. This was the soundscape of the medieval market, an exhilarating, exhausting, and utterly immersive sensory experience that was chaotic, vibrant, and unforgettable. Walking through the bustling lanes, your stomach would inevitably begin to rumble, guided by the most irresistible aromas to the beating heart of the market's sustenance, the food hall. This was more than just a place to eat. It was a vivid, edible map of the medieval social order, a place where your wealth and status dictated what filled your belly, from the humblest bowl of pottage to the most exotic spiced wine. For the vast majority of market-goers, the peasants, laborers, and apprentices, a meal was a simple, practical affair centered around portable, affordable energy. The undisputed king of this common fare was a steaming, savory loaf of bread. Bakers' stalls were strategically placed near entrances, using their heavenly aroma as a powerful lure. A common purchase was a thick slice of coarse, dark rye or barley bread, often used as an edible plate called a trencher. Onto this edible platter, a vendor would ladle a hearty helping of pottage, a thick, stew-like concoction that was the cornerstone of the peasant diet. This was not a single recipe but a versatile, slow-simmered pot of whatever was cheap and available, oats, barley, or peas, enriched with a bit of bacon fat or a handful of leafy greens, and perhaps a few scraps of meat if one was lucky. Washed down with a generous tankard of small ale, a weak, low-alcohol brew that was safer to drink than most water. This meal provided the necessary calories to fuel hours of hard work or bartering. Surrounding these central stalls was a constellation of other humble, essential vendors. Cheesemongers offered rounds of hard, salty cheese that could last for months, perfect for storing through winter. A woman from a nearby farm might have a basket of hard-boiled eggs, a precious source of protein sold one by one. For a special treat, a child might be given a penny to buy a crisp apple from a fruit seller's pyramid, or a simple pastry, perhaps a fried dough twist dusted with coarse sugar. This was food for sustenance, for survival, and its purchase was a quick, functional transaction. But just a few stalls away, an entirely different culinary world unfolded, one that catered to the senses and the ego of the wealthy. Here, the air itself changed, spiced with the incredible, almost magical aromas of distant lands. This was the domain of the wealthy spice merchant, a figure of immense mystery and prestige. His stall was a carefully curated spectacle of luxury, a sensory testament to his wealth and global connections. He didn't shout his prices, he whispered them, knowing his customers sought exclusivity, not a bargain. On his table, displayed on small velvet cloths or in intricate brass bowls, lay the true treasures of the medieval world. There was pepper, worth its weight in silver, its sharp, pungent grains all the way from the Malabar coast of India. There was ginger, cinnamon, and cloves, each with their own distinct perfume and purported medicinal properties. And most valuable of all was saffron, the vivid red stigma of a specific crocus flower. It took over 70,000 hand-picked flowers to produce a single pound of the spice, making it more expensive than gold. A wealthy household's use of saffron to turn a dish a luxurious yellow was a blatant, delicious display of their immense wealth. Alongside these spices were other imported luxuries that spoke of sun-drenched foreign soils: sticky sweet dates from North Africa, chewy figs and raisins from the Mediterranean, and almonds that had traveled vast distances. These were not mere ingredients, they were status symbols. A lord's cook purchasing a small packet of pepper was not just buying flavor, he was buying a piece of a world most would never see. An ingredient that would transform a simple meal into a powerful statement of power and refinement at the evening's feast. The transaction at this stall was slow, respectful, and involved careful weighing on tiny, precise scales. A silent ritual as far removed from the noisy haggling over eggs as the lord's castle was from a peasant's cottage. Bridging the gap between these two extremes were the cooked food vendors, the original fast food chefs, who catered to anyone with a spare coin and a hungry appetite. Their sizzling stalls offered a taste of indulgence for a broader audience. You could buy a hot, greasy pie filled with minced meat and spices, its crust sturdy enough to eat while walking. Savory pancakes might be fried on a griddle and topped with cheese or meat. For those feeling particularly flush, a vendor might be roasting joints of meat on a turning spit, the fat dripping and crackling onto the fire below, filling the air with a smell so delicious it was almost painful. This was where a commoner might choose to spend a few hard-earned pennies for a taste of something special. A brief, savory escape from the daily grind of bread and pottage, participating in the market's bounty in their own small way. Amidst the vibrant chaos of the common market, there stood a place of comparative quiet and immense gravity, the cloth hall. Often a grand, purpose-built stone structure with a vaulted ceiling that swallowed sound. This was the financial district of the medieval world. The air here was different, thick with the earthy, lanolin-rich scent of raw wool and the sharper chemical tang of dyes like woad and madder. This was not a place for the hurried purchase of a meal or the simple barter of eggs. The transactions that occurred under this roof were measured, deliberate, and involved sums of money that could bankrupt a small farmer, or make the fortune of a merchant's entire lineage. The cloth on display here was a silent but screaming advertisement of social status, and its quality was a direct reflection of immense, specialized labor. On one end of the spectrum was the rough, sturdy homespun, known as linsey woolsey. Woven on simple looms in village cottages, it was a practical blend of flax and wool, durable and warm but coarse to the touch. Its natural, undyed color ranged from the grayish-brown of a sheep's undercoat to a creamy off-white. This was the fabric of the common folk, the cloth of hard work and humble means, traded in bulk for a predictable, modest price. But as you moved further into the hall, the textures and colors transformed. The real money was in the finished broadcloths, especially those imported from the powerhouse regions of Flanders and Italy. Flemish wool was the super fabric of the Middle Ages, renowned across Europe for its exceptional quality. The process to create it was painstaking. It began with the careful breeding of sheep in England, whose fine, long stapled wool was considered the best raw material in the world. This raw wool was then exported to the sophisticated urban workshops of cities like Bruges and Ghent. There, teams of highly skilled artisans took over. The wool was meticulously cleaned, carded, and spun into an incredibly fine, strong thread. It was then woven on complex looms into a dense, tight fabric that was next handed to the fullers. These men walked on the cloth for hours as it soaked in a mixture of water and fuller's earth, a clay that absorbed oils and dirt. This process, called walking or treading, shrank and felted the fibers, matting them together into a weather-resistant, incredibly durable material that was almost felt like in its density. The final and most visually stunning stage was the dyeing. Color was luxury, and the depth and vibrancy of a hue were directly tied to its cost. Common colors like yellows and browns came from affordable materials like onion skins or walnut hulls. But the most coveted and expensive colors spoke of vast trade networks. A deep, rich red came from the madder root, or for the ultra-wealthy, the tiny kermes insect, which feed on certain Mediterranean oaks. It took thousands of these insects to produce a single gram of dye, making scarlet a color synonymous with nobility and the church. The most legendary hue was Tyrian purple, derived from the mucous glands of a specific sea snail. A color so prohibitively expensive, it was reserved almost exclusively for royalty. Seeing a bolt of truly vibrant, color-fast crimson or deep blue in the dim light of the cloth hall was like seeing a bar of solid gold. The bargaining that occurred here was a world away from the cheerful, loud haggling over pots and pies. This was a silent, intense duel of expertise and nerve. A wealthy merchant or a lord's steward would approach a stall. He wouldn't speak a price. Instead, his hands would reach out, his fingers expertly testing the weight and density of the cloth, rubbing a corner between his thumb and forefinger to judge its fineness. He would hold it up to the light filtering through a high window, checking for any flaws in the weave or inconsistencies in the dye. The merchant, for his part, would stand quietly, his confidence in his product his best sales tactic. The negotiation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, a complex dance of mutual respect and veiled threats. The buyer might mention a competitor's price from the last market day. The seller would counter by subtly reminding the buyer of the long journey this cloth had taken, the skill of the weavers, the rarity of the dye. A price might be suggested by tracing a number with a finger on the palm of the hand, a discreet method kept from prying eyes and ears. A deal for a single large order of fine broadcloth could represent a year's income for the merchant, and would define the sartorial elegance of the local gentry for a season. This was where the medieval economy truly flexed its muscle, in the quiet, weighty exchange of something that was both a simple commodity and a potent symbol of power, piety, and place in the world. Yet if you followed your ears away from the hushed cloth hall, and toward the source of a rising cacophony of bleats, bellows, and shouted negotiations, you'd find yourself in a world that was both more primal and just as financially critical: the livestock market. This was the agricultural stock exchange of the medieval world, a muddy, noisy, and utterly vital arena where families' walking, breathing wealth was evaluated, argued over, and ultimately converted into coin. Pushed to the outskirts of the main marketplace for very practical reasons, the livestock section was a sensory experience all its own. Underfoot, the ground was a churned-up quagmire of mud and straw, thick enough to suck the shoes right off your feet after a rain. The air hung heavy with the honest, pungent smells of the farm: the sweet, dry scent of hay, the musky odor of damp wool, and the undeniable sharp tang of manure. This was not a place for the delicate or the faint of heart. It was a zone of serious, physical business, where the primary commodities had minds of their own and needed to be constantly managed. Here, the social hierarchy of the market took on a different form. The wealthy merchants in their fine cloaks were rare visitors. This was the domain of the farmers, the peasants, the professional drovers, and the lord's stockmen. Deals here weren't whispered over a velvet-covered table. They were shouted over the frantic bleating of sheep or the nervous lowing of cattle. A farmer's entire annual income could be tied up in the dozen sheep he'd carefully nurtured over the spring and summer. A single milking cow represented not just a source of daily nutrition, but a significant financial asset, a living bank account on four hooves. The stakes in this muddy field were as high as any transaction in the cloth hall. The process of buying and selling an animal was a meticulous ritual of inspection and trust. This was far more complex than simply agreeing on a price per head. A prospective buyer, whether a wealthy landlord looking to restock his herds or a butcher assessing his next week's meat, would approach an animal with a critical, experienced eye. His hands were his most important tools. He would run his fingers through the fleece of a sheep, feeling for the density and length of the wool, assessing its quality and weight. For a cow or an ox, he would carefully check its teeth to gauge its age, feeling the haunches and shoulders for muscle and condition. He'd watch the animal move, looking for any hint of a limp or lameness that could signal a deeper problem. Every detail, from the clarity of its eyes to the sheen of its coat, was a data point in a rapid mental calculation of the animal's value. The negotiation that followed this inspection was a rapid-fire, coded language all its own, a world away from the drawn-out haggling over a pot. Offers and counteroffers were shouted, often accompanied by a slap on the animal's rump to emphasize a point. The seller would extol the virtues of his beast, its proven fertility, its excellent health, the superior quality of its wool. The buyer would point out perceived flaws: a slight cough, a leaner frame than ideal, the cost of driving it back to his own land. The deal was often sealed not with a handshake, but with a slap of hands, a firm, public gesture known as the God's penny, or earnest money, where small coin was passed from buyer to seller to symbolize that the agreement was binding. Breaking such a deal was a serious offense against both the other party and the community's understood code of conduct. For the truly large transactions, like the purchase of a team of oxen needed to pull a plough, the Lord's officials were always nearby. The bailiff or his representative would witness the deal, ensure the standards were met, and most importantly, collect the sales tax due to the manor. The presence of these officials added another layer of gravity to the proceedings, a reminder that even in this muddy, chaotic field, the Lord's economic engine was always turning, and his share was never forgotten. This was where the abstract wealth of the land was made tangible, a noisy, dirty, and utterly essential heartbeat of the medieval rural economy. Leaving the earthy cacophony of the livestock market behind, the next sensory assault was one of heat, smoke, and the most distinctive sound of medieval industry: the rhythmic, percussive ring of hammer on anvil. This was the domain of the metalworkers, a row of stalls that hummed with the energy of transformation, where raw, dirty ore and discarded scraps were forged into the very sinews of daily life, from the most humble household object to the instruments of war and status. The centerpiece of every stall here was the forge itself, a simple, open hearth of clay and stone, fueled by a constant supply of charcoal that glowed with an intense, mesmerizing heat. A young apprentice, his face smudged with soot and gleaming with sweat, would work a set of large bellows, his entire body rocking back and forth to force air into the coals, making them roar and flare with a white-hot intensity. This was the engine of creation, the elemental heart from which all their goods were born, and the sounds were a symphony of industry. The air was filled with a constant, overlapping soundtrack of metallic percussion. There was the heavy, foundational clang. Clang of the blacksmith himself, a burly figure wielding a heavy sledgehammer with practiced, economic swings, shaping a glowing red bar of iron on his anvil. Interwoven with this were the lighter, faster, more precise tapping sounds of the whitesmith or cutler, using smaller hammers to put a fine edge on a blade or add delicate decorative touches to a finished piece. It was a chaotic yet harmonious orchestra of making. The goods on display here formed a perfect visual representation of the feudal social pyramid. At the very base, both in cost and function, were the simple, essential iron nails. Sold by weight from a large wooden bucket, these were the unsung heroes of medieval construction, holding together everything from peasant cottages to great sailing ships. Next to them were the practical tools of agriculture, and woodworking simple but effective iron hoe blades, axe heads, saw blades, and the heavy metal fittings for carts and wagons. These items were the backbone of the local economy, purchased by farmers and craftsmen who needed durability and function above all else. A step up were the goods that touched every home, multiple times a day: the cooking pots. These were not the thin, lightweight pans of today. A medieval cooking pot, or cauldron, was a significant investment. A heavy, three-legged vessel made of thick cast iron or bronze, designed to withstand a lifetime of hanging over an open fire. A woman would test its weight and balance, running her fingers over the inside to check for a smooth finish, knowing this single object would be central to her family's survival. Alongside the pots were the knives, from small, personal eating knives that every man, woman, and child carried, to larger, more serious butchering and kitchen knives. The quality of the steel, the sharpness of the edge, and the comfort of the handle were all points of intense scrutiny. But at the far end of the row, the atmosphere shifted. The stalls grew larger, more permanent, and the goods on display were not laid out on simple wooden tables, but presented with ceremony. Here worked the armorers and the swordsmiths, the elite craftsmen of the metalworking world. Their trade was not in utility, but in protection, status, and violence. The items here were not merely functional. They were works of art and lethal engineering. You might see a shirt of chainmail, thousands of meticulously riveted iron rings, woven together into a heavy, flexible metal fabric that could deflect a slashing blade. A wealthy knight or his squire would test its weight on his shoulders, feeling the distribution of the immense burden he would wear for hours in battle. Next to it might be a polished steel helmet, its surface gleaming dully, or a pair of gauntlets, each finger joint perfectly articulated. The pinnacle of the display would be the swords. These were not mere bars of sharpened metal. They were carefully balanced instruments, with a blade that might feature a subtle pattern from being forged from layers of different grades of iron and steel. a crossguard to protect the hand, and a pommel to counterbalance the weight. The purchase of such a weapon was a long, serious discussion between the smith and the client, involving questions of balance, grip, and the specific style of combat it was intended for. A transaction in the metalworkers' row was a testament to the absolute trust a buyer placed in the smith's skill. There were no returns, no warranties. When a farmer purchased a new axe head, he was betting his livelihood on the quality of the iron and the temper of the steel. If it shattered on a tough piece of oak, it could mean a ruined tool and a dangerous loss of time. When a knight commissioned a new sword, he was literally trusting his life to the smith's expertise. This relationship between maker and user was sacred, built on a reputation earned one hammer strike at a time. The smith's mark, a unique symbol struck into the finished product, was his brand, his signature, and his promise, a small, permanent guarantee of quality in a world where your tools, your pots, and your weapons were not just possessions, but extensions of your own body and the key to your survival. After the heat and noise of the forges, the next stall offered a starkly different sensory experience, one of strange, earthy fragrances and an almost palpable aura of mystery. Here, the air grew still and heavy with the scent of dried flowers, pungent resins, and the deep, loamy smell of roots pulled from the dark earth. This was the domain of the apothecary, a figure who occupied a unique and powerful space in the medieval mind, serving as physician, chemist, botanist, and sometimes even mystic, all at once. His stall was a physical library of remedies, a chaotic yet organized collection of nature's potential, where the line between cutting-edge science, ancient superstition, and outright magic was so blurred as to be invisible. The visual presentation was a carefully crafted performance designed to inspire both confidence and awe. The apothecary himself, often an older man with the stained fingers and deliberate movements of a lifelong scholar, would be the still center of this aromatic storm. His wares were displayed with a reverence usually reserved for holy relics. Dozens of beautifully turned ceramic jars, each labeled in a spidery Latin hand, lined the shelves behind him. Clear glass bottles, a rare and expensive luxury, held dark, mysterious liquids and pale, floating tinctures that caught the light. On the counter before him, small, intricately carved wooden boxes held his most precious and potent ingredients, their contents protected from the sun and prying eyes. The inventory was a breathtaking catalogue of the known world and its imagined properties. Neatly tied bundles of drying herbs hung from the stall's canopy, common sage and rosemary for digestion, lavender to soothe headaches and aid sleep, and the more dangerous foxglove, whose leaves, used with terrifying imprecision, could either slow a racing heart or stop it entirely. But the true treasures were in the jars. There was the vibrant yellow powder of turmeric, the rusty red strands of precious saffron, and the knobby, exotic shapes of ginger root. These were imports, worth a small fortune, sold by the pennyweight for their purported power to cure everything from melancholy to the plague. Yet this world of botanical medicine was deeply intertwined with principles that seem utterly alien to us now. The apothecary's art was heavily influenced by the ancient theory of the four humours: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. It was believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of these bodily fluids, and every treatment was designed to counteract it. A patient suffering from a fever, seen as an excess of hot, fiery yellow bile, would be prescribed a cooling, moistening remedy made from cucumber or lily root. Someone lethargic and pale, suffering from a cold, phlegmatic imbalance, would be given a heating spice like pepper or ginger to restore their inner fire. This logic extended beyond plants into the realm of the mystical doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God had marked everything he created with a sign, or signature, that indicated its purpose. A walnut, with its shell resembling a skull and its kernel looking like a brain, was therefore prescribed for headaches and brain ailments. The spotted leaves of the lungwort plant, which were thought to look like a diseased lung, were used to treat tuberculosis and coughs. The red sap of the bloodroot plant was used to treat blood disorders. This system, which made perfect sense within their worldview, created a parallel universe of meaning for every root, leaf, and flower. And then there were the ingredients that truly tested the limits of belief, items that came not from the garden, but from the realm of superstition and global myth. The apothecary's shelves might hold a small, expensive vial labeled mummia, a powder made from ground-up Egyptian mummies, believed to be a powerful cure-all, and a potent Chinese letter because of the embalming resins. There might be unicorn horn, which was almost always the elongated tusk of a narwhal, used to detect and neutralize poisons. Bezoar stones, hard, concrete-like masses, formed in the guts of goats and other animals, were highly prized as universal antidotes. These items, bizarre to our eyes, were the medieval equivalent of cutting-edge pharmaceuticals. Their astronomical prices a testament to the desperate hope they offered to the wealthy and the mortally ill. A transaction at this stall was therefore an act of profound faith in the apothecary's knowledge, faith in the ancient theories he followed, and faith that somewhere in this chaotic collection of nature's oddities lay the secret to cheating death itself. Yet even with the serious business of commerce and the harsh lessons of justice, the medieval market understood the human need for release, for joy, and for spectacle. On the very fringes of the official marketplace, often just beyond the toll collector's booth, an entire unofficial economy of entertainment thrived. This was the district of diversion, a vibrant, chaotic, and sometimes shocking carnival where the goal wasn't to acquire goods, but to experience wonder, forget one's troubles, and perhaps toss a coin or two to those who made it possible. Here, the soundtrack shifted from the shouts of vendors to the lively strains of a pipe and tabor, the rhythmic jingle of a tambourine, and the gasps and laughter of a captivated crowd. The star performers in this open-air theatre were the itinerant entertainers, the jugglers, acrobats, and minstrels who lived a precarious existence on the road, their entire livelihood dependent on their ability to charm and amaze. A juggler might command a small clearing, his hands a blur as he kept a startling number of wooden clubs or brightly colored balls dancing in the air. His performance was a masterclass in concentration and skill, each successful catch punctuated by the appreciative cheers of the onlookers. Nearby, an acrobat might be performing breathtaking flips and human pyramids with a partner, their bodies bending in seemingly impossible ways, all without a safety net. The risk was part of the thrill. A single misstep could mean a broken bone and an end to their income, and the crowd watched with a mixture of awe and anxiety. Weaving through these acts were the mummers, the storytellers of the medieval world, often wearing simple, iconic masks or scraps of costume to denote characters like the hero, the villain, or the fool. They would perform short, raucous, and often deeply satirical plays. Their subjects were the great stories. Everyone knew the tales of St. George slaying the dragon, or the adventures of Robin Hood, but they were also not afraid to poke fun at local authorities, the clergy, or the quirks of village life. Their performances were rowdy, interactive, and filled with slapstick humor, providing a sanctioned outlet for social commentary and collective laughter. For a few precious minutes, the rigid social order was turned upside down for a joke, and a peasant could laugh at a character representing the greedy lord, all without fear of reprisal. The mummer's hat, passed around at the end of the play, would hopefully be filled with pennies from an audience grateful for the release. But this entertainment district had a much darker, more brutal side, one that reveals a stark contrast to our modern sensibilities. For many, the greatest draw was not skill or comedy, but raw, visceral bloodsport. The most popular of these cruel spectacles was bear baiting. A captured bear, often declawed, and with its teeth filed down to make the sport less immediately lethal for the dogs, would be chained to a post in the center of a makeshift arena. A succession of aggressive dogs, usually large mastiffs or bulldogs bred for tenacity and power, would then be set upon the confused and terrified animal. The crowd would roar its approval, placing bets on which dog would last the longest, or how many it would take to finally bring the great beast down. The appeal was primal, a vicarious experience of violence, danger, and the ultimate test of strength between two powerful animals. Cockfighting and dogfighting were also common, smaller-scale events that drew enthusiastic, betting crowds. Their brutality seen not as cruelty, but as a natural and exciting pastime. This sharp divide between the light and the dark, the skillful and the savage, was a perfect reflection of the medieval world itself. The same crowd that gasped in delight at a juggler's precision could moments later scream in bloodlust at the baiting pit. Life was often harsh, short, and unforgiving, and this was mirrored in their leisure pursuits. The entertainment fringe offered a complete emotional spectrum. It provided escape, wonder, and communal laughter, but it also catered to a deep-seated fascination with danger, power, and the raw realities of a world where survival was never guaranteed. It was all part of the market's vast, overwhelming tapestry, a place where one could witness the very best and the very worst of human nature playing out within a few yards of each other. Yet for all its wonder and vitality, the market's immense crowds and distracted atmosphere created a perfect hunting ground for a different kind of professional, one who earned their living not through honest trade or entertainment, but through stealth, deception, and the art of the light-fingered grab. This was the ever-present darker side of the market day, a thriving underworld of pickpockets, cutpurses, and con artists, who viewed the bustling throng not as a community, but as a target-rich environment. For every honest merchant shouting his wares, there was likely a silent, watchful thief calculating the easiest way to separate a visitor from their hard-earned money. The most common and feared of these predators was the cutpurse. In an era where everyone carried their wealth in a leather or cloth purse dangling from a belt, the technique was brutally simple, but required immense skill and audacity. These thieves worked in teams, often using distractions orchestrated by accomplices. One might stage a loud argument or a fake fainting spell, drawing all eyes and creating a moment of confusion. In that split second, a second thief would glide through the crowd, his movements smooth and deliberate. With a small, incredibly sharp knife, he would make a single, precise upward slice, severing the cords that held the purse to its owner's belt. The purse would drop into his waiting hand, and he would melt back into the crowd before the victim ever felt the slight tug, or noticed the sudden lightness at their hip. The speed and precision of a skilled cutpurse were legendary. A good one could empty a dozen purses in a single market day without ever being noticed. For those without the nerve for such blade work, pickpocketing offered a slightly less risky alternative. These thieves relied on touch and misdirection rather than cutting. Their fingers were trained to be delicate and nimble, able to gently probe and explore the folds of a person's clothing without triggering alarm. They might bump into someone accidentally with one hand while the other dipped into a pocket or loosened a pouch string. They often worked in crowded pinch points, near a popular food stall, at the entrance to the livestock area, or while everyone was craning their necks to watch a bear baiting. Their targets were the distracted, the drunk, and the overwhelmed, those whose attention was completely absorbed by the market's spectacle. But perhaps the most creatively cruel operators were the con artists, the masters of the long game who used psychology instead of sleight of hand. Their schemes were elaborate performances designed to build false trust and exploit human greed. A common scam involved the found ring. A well-dressed accomplice would drop a cheap but shiny brass ring in front of a likely target. The con artist would then discover it at the same time, expressing great excitement and claiming it was a valuable piece of gold jewelry, perhaps even a lost noble's signet ring. He would then offer to sell it to the mark for a fraction of its supposed value, a price that was still a significant sum for the victim. The target, believing they were getting an incredible bargain, would hand over their money, only to discover later they had purchased a worthless piece of metal. Another classic ruse was the petition scam. A convincingly desperate-looking individual, often a woman with a child, would approach a well-off-looking visitor. She would tell a heart-wrenching tale of woe her husband imprisoned unfairly, a fire that destroyed their home, a sick child needing medicine. She would produce an official-looking but completely fake document, a petition for aid, and beg the kind stranger to add their name, and more importantly, a charitable donation to the list of benefactors. Appealing to Christian charity and social status, this scam preyed on the victim's desire to be seen as generous and important, fleecing them under the guise of doing a good deed. Constant vigilance was the only real defense against this underworld. Advice from the period warned people to always keep their purse in their hand in a crowd, to wear it under their outer garment rather than outside, and to be deeply suspicious of any stranger who tried to get too close or create a distraction. The threat of theft was simply a calculated risk of attending the market, a tax on carelessness paid not to the Lord, but to the shadow economy that operated just beneath the surface of the sanctioned one. It was a reminder that within the vibrant heart of the community, the struggle between greed and trust, between cunning and vigilance, was being played out in 1,000 invisible ways every single market day. This organized chaos of commerce and crime was also one of the most profound social experiments of the Middle Ages. For a few hours each week, the rigid, unmovable pyramid of feudal society was temporarily compressed into a single, teeming space. The market square became a rare and potent social leveler, a shared stage where every stratum of society, from the lowliest serf to the highest nobility, was forced to coexist, observe one another, and engage in the universal dance of trade. It was a place of stark contrasts and surprising connections, a living snapshot of the entire medieval world in microcosm. Of course, this didn't mean that social hierarchies vanished. They were simply expressed through geography and activity, rather than through absolute separation. You could visually map the social order by observing who stood where and what they were doing. The lord or his steward, if he deigned to attend personally, would never be found jostling in the crowd for a loaf of bread. He would be conducting his business in the quiet, stone-built permanence of the cloth hall, or perhaps receiving the respect and the tax revenues from his bailiff in a temporary booth set up for official business. His presence was felt everywhere, but his physical person remained elevated, both literally and figuratively, often observing the scene from a raised platform or the upper window of a house overlooking the square. He participated in the market, but he was never truly of the market. The clergy were another ever-present and distinctive group, their dark robes moving through the crowd like sober threads in a brightly colored tapestry. A parish priest might be there on practical business, purchasing wax for church candles or wine for the Mass, his spiritual authority granting him a respectful space even in the thickest press of bodies. But the market also presented him with a pastoral challenge and opportunity. This was where his flock gathered in its entirety, and it was his duty to move among them, offering blessings, hearing snippets of confession, and perhaps gently reminding the rowdier elements of the moral code, especially as the day wore on and the ale flowed more freely. For the common people, seeing their priest navigating the same worldly temptations and practical concerns they faced, could make him seem more human, more connected to their daily struggles. The true heart and soul of the market, however, was the broad spectrum of the common folk: the free peasants, the skilled craftsmen, the housewives, and the apprentices. This was their day of relative freedom, a sanctioned break from the back-breaking labor of the fields or the monotonous discipline of the workshop. For a serf bound to his lord's land, the market charter often granted him safe passage to attend, a temporary leave from his feudal obligations. Here he could stand shoulder to shoulder with a free peasant and barter on equal terms. A woman whose world was typically confined to the home and the village well could operate her own stall, earn her own coin, and make her own deals, enjoying a level of economic agency and social interaction unavailable to her almost anywhere else. The market gave her a public voice and a recognized value beyond her domestic role. This unprecedented mixing created a fascinating and often tense social atmosphere. It was a place of observation and performance. A young apprentice, dressed in his Sunday best, might strut through the crowds, trying to catch the eye of a merchant's daughter, his behavior a careful performance of aspirations above his station. A wealthy merchant's wife, parading in a dress trimmed with expensive rabbit fur, was not just staying warm. She was displaying her husband's success to the entire community, inviting both admiration and jealousy. The market was the medieval equivalent of social media, a place to see and be seen, to gauge your standing, and to project an image of who you were worth, or who you wanted to be. Despite the clear social boundaries, the very nature of commerce could create moments of startling intimacy and forced equality. A high-born lady who would never deign to speak to a peasant farmer in another context might nonetheless spend 5 minutes haggling intensely with his wife over the price of a particularly fine cheese. A lord's cook, purchasing spices for his master's table, had to treat the apothecary with a degree of respect, acknowledging his specialized knowledge and relying on his expertise. In that moment of transaction, the social hierarchy was temporarily flattened by a mutual need. The peasant needed the coin, and the noble's representative needed the goods. This created a fragile, temporary bridge across the vast chasm of class, a reminder that for all the laws and customs that separated them, everyone was ultimately bound together in a single, interdependent economic system. The market was the one place where that system became visible, tangible, and absolutely undeniable. Now, imagine trying to conduct all this complex business in a space where no two people seemed to speak the same language. The medieval marketplace was a true Babel of tongues, a swirling vortex of dialects, accents, and foreign languages where communication was less about perfect grammar and more about sheer, creative determination. This was not a world of universal translators or phrasebooks. It was a world where a deal worth a family's annual income could hinge on a misheard number, a misunderstood gesture, or the ability to find a sliver of common ground in a sea of linguistic chaos. The primary challenge was immense. A merchant from the bustling German city of Lübeck, his speech clipped and guttural, might find himself standing across from a trader from Genoa, whose rapid, musical Italian sounded like a completely different species of communication. A Spanish wool exporter could be trying to convince a Flemish cloth maker of his product's quality, while an English buyer shouted numbers in heavily accented French. This was the reality of international trade, yet commerce refused to be stopped by mere language barriers. Instead, a fascinating ad hoc system of communication evolved. A pragmatic blend of broken common tongues, sacred academic language, and a universally understood ballet of hands and gestures. For the high-value international traders dealing in cloth, spices, and wine, the closest thing to a common language was often a very rough, utilitarian form of medieval Latin. This wasn't the polished, Ciceronian Latin of the scholars. It was a functional, stripped-down mercantile patois, often heavily influenced by the speaker's native tongue. It was a language of numbers, weights, measures, and basic transactional phrases. A German merchant might point to a bolt of cloth and say, bona lona. Praeterum, good wool, price. Mangling the grammar but making his meaning painfully clear. The Italian seller might respond by holding up fingers and stating, Viginti solidi, 20 shillings, and the haggling would commence in this fractured, yet mutually intelligible, linguistic middle ground. For these men, Latin was not a language of prayer or poetry. It was a tool, a rusty but effective key to unlocking a lucrative deal. But for the vast majority of people in the market, Latin was as foreign as the spices from India. Their world ran on a far more immediate and universal language, the elaborate, intricate, and highly formalized system of hand signals. In the roaring din of the livestock pen or the crowded aisle of the pottery stalls, where shouts could be misheard and accents made words unintelligible, the hands did the talking. This was a silent code that everyone understood. The negotiation for a sheep, for instance, was a rapid-fire conversation conducted entirely with fingers. A seller might hold up his hand, fingers splayed, to indicate 5. But to specify 5 shillings, he might then tap his palm with the fingers of his other hand. A buyer's counteroffer of 3 shillings might be shown by holding up 3 fingers, then making a cutting motion across his own wrist to signify the silver coin. To indicate he thought the animal was too thin, the buyer might pinch the skin on his own forearm and shake his head. A nod, a handshake, a slap on the rump. Each gesture carried a specific, unambiguous meaning that transcended words. This visual language prevented costly misunderstandings and allowed for swift, efficient deals in the most chaotic environments. Beyond gestures, the market also relied on the physical evidence of the goods themselves. A farmer didn't need to speak a word to sell his apples. He simply lined them up in perfect, gleaming rows, their flawless skins and vibrant colors announcing their quality more effectively than any sales pitch. A potter could demonstrate the strength of his wares by rapping his knuckles against a bowl, the clear ring proving it was well fired and free of cracks. The cloth merchant would invite a customer to feel the weight and texture of the wool, a tactile experience that needed no translation. The goods were their own best ambassadors, speaking a silent language of quality, utility, and value that every potential buyer, regardless of their origin, could instinctively understand. In the end, the true language of the medieval market was not Latin, or French, or English. It was the language of mutual need. It was the shared desire to trade, to prosper, and to connect. It was found in the patient smile of a merchant, trying a third different word for price, in the universal frustration of a buyer who couldn't make himself understood, and in the triumphant, shared laughter when a deal was finally struck through a combination of grunts, gestures, and sheer force of will. This linguistic free-for-all was a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless drive for exchange, proving that when there is a will to trade, a way to communicate will always be found. Yet within this seeming free-for-all of goods and prices, a powerful invisible force maintained order and guaranteed a basic standard of trust, the meticulous system of quality control enforced by the guilds and the Lord's own market officials. For all its vibrant chaos, the medieval market was not a lawless place. It was a meticulously regulated arena where your reputation and your livelihood depended on meeting community standards, and where a network of inspectors ensured that no one could easily cheat their neighbors. The first line of defense for quality was the powerful craft guilds. These were more than just medieval unions. They were intricate systems of social organization, training, and economic protectionism. Each skilled trade, the bakers, the butchers, the goldsmiths, the weavers, operated under the strict authority of its own guild. A guild's most sacred duty was to protect the integrity of its craft and the reputation of its members. To this end, they maintained incredibly detailed regulations governing every aspect of production. A guild charter would specify the exact materials that could be used, the approved methods of construction, and even the number of apprentices a master could employ. This wasn't about stifling innovation. It was about ensuring that when a customer bought a product bearing a guild member's mark, they knew exactly what they were getting. That mark, stamped onto a loaf of bread, punched into the base of a pewter cup, or woven into the edge of a broadcloth, was a promise, a guarantee that the item had been made to the guild's exacting standards by a trained and sanctioned craftsman. To enforce these rules, the guilds employed their own inspectors. These were senior, respected masters of the craft, who had the authority to conduct surprise visits to any member's workshop. They would examine raw materials, scrutinize works in progress, and test finished goods. A baker found using inferior or adulterated flour, or a butcher selling rotten meat disguised with spices, would face severe penalties from his own guild long before the Lord's officials ever got involved. Punishments could include heavy fines, being forced to destroy the substandard goods publicly, or in extreme cases, expulsion from the guild, a professional death sentence that stripped a craftsman of his right to trade legally within the town. This internal policing was crucial. It allowed the guilds to maintain a monopoly on quality and present a unified, trustworthy front to the consuming public. But the guilds only covered their own members. For everyone else, and for the enforcement of public standards like weights and measures, the Lord's market officials held supreme authority. The most famous of these figures were the ale conner and the bread wearer, whose titles barely scratch the surface of their fascinating and vital roles. The ale conner, sometimes known as an ale taster, had one of the most unique job descriptions in history. His duty was to ensure the quality and fair pricing of the most important beverage in the medieval world. He didn't rely on complex chemical analysis. His tools were his expert palate and a simple leather stool. He would visit every ale cellar in the market, pay the set price for a tankard, and then pour a small amount onto the stool before sitting down on it. After a few minutes, he would stand up. If his leather breeches stuck to the stool, it was a sure sign the brewer had added too much sugar or other cheap additives to mask a poor quality brew. The offending alewife or brewer would be heavily fined, and their bad ale was likely poured out into the street. It was a brilliantly simple, publicly visible test that guaranteed a basic standard for the community's primary drink. The bread wearer was equally important. Bread was so fundamental to the medieval diet that its price and weight were fixed by law to prevent profiteering during times of scarcity. The bread wearer's tool was the official set of scales, and his reference was the assize of bread and ale, a legal document that dictated exactly how much a penny loaf should weigh based on the current price of grain. He would move through the market, randomly selecting loaves and placing them on his scale. A baker caught selling underweight bread was not just cheating his customers. He was breaking the Lord's law and threatening public order. His punishment was often a very public and humiliating stint in the stocks, with the fraudulent loaf hung around his neck as a badge of his dishonesty. Beyond these specialized roles, the Lord's bailiff and his general market officials were the ultimate arbiters of fairness. They carried the official standards of measurement, the bronze yardstick for cloth, the precisely carved wooden bushel for grain, the set of certified stone weights for metals. Any merchant could bring a dispute to them, and they had the authority to inspect any stall, check any scale, and settle any argument on the spot. Their presence was a constant reminder that the vibrant energy of the market existed within a framework of law and tradition. A system designed not to stifle commerce, but to protect it by ensuring that trust, the most valuable currency of all, was never debased. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, a subtle but undeniable shift moved through the crowd. The frantic energy of the midday rush gave way to a more deliberate, weary pace. The sharp, competitive cries of the vendors softened, replaced by the sounds of negotiation winding down and the practical noises of disassembly. The great engine of commerce was powering down, and a new, more personal accounting was about to begin. The market day was ending, but for the participants, some of the most crucial work was just starting. The first signs were visual. The vibrant, artful displays that had drawn customers all day began to deconstruct. Colorful cloths that had served as backdrops were folded with care and packed away. The proud pyramids of pottery were carefully disassembled, each piece individually wrapped in straw and nestled back into the relative safety of wooden crates. For the livestock traders, this was the most chaotic part of the day, as sold animals were separated from those remaining, their panicked cries filling the air as new groups were formed for the journey home. The empty spaces left by departed carts created sudden voids in the square, like missing teeth in a smile, revealing the trampled, litter-strewn ground beneath. The air, once thick with the enticing smells of food and spice, now carried the dust of dismantlement and the faint scent of exhaustion. This was also the hour of settling accounts. The complex web of credit and debt that had been woven throughout the day now had to be untangled. A potter who had purchased a hot pie from a baker on the promise of payment later would now seek him out to hand over the owed pennies. The cloth merchant who had bought a spare rope from a cordwainer would settle his debt. This settling was a matter of honor and future credibility. A merchant known for skipping out on his debts would find no credit extended to him at the next market. These transactions were quiet, personal affairs, a handshake and a muttered, "Until next time," sealing the deal as importantly as any written contract. For those who had traveled far, the packing was a race against the fading light. Every item secured was one less worry on the dark, potentially dangerous roads home. The luckiest vendors, those who had sold all their wares, could pack light, their empty carts rattling cheerfully. But for others, the packing was a somber affair. Each unsold item represented a hope dashed, a calculation that had proven wrong. A farmer carefully rebundling his leftover vegetables was silently calculating the cost of the journey against his meager earnings. A craftsman wrapping his unsold wares was not just packing objects. He was packing away disappointment, to be unpacked and re-examined before the next market, a constant reminder of the fickle nature of public demand. Then came the most private and telling ritual of the entire day, the counting of the take. In a quiet corner of a packed cart, behind a makeshift curtain, or simply hunched over with their back to the world, each merchant and producer performed this final arithmetic. For the wealthy merchant, this might involve a heavy leather purse being emptied onto a small, portable counting board, its grooves and lines helping to sort and add the bewildering array of foreign and local coins. The chime of silver and gold was a sweet sound, a direct measure of success, But for the vast majority, the profit was a more complicated calculation. A peasant family might have a small handful of low-value coins, but their real earnings were often in kind. They would carefully assess the goods they had acquired through barter: a new iron pot for the hearth, a length of decent woolen cloth for a winter cloak, a precious bag of salt, a new knife. They would weigh the value of these items against what they had brought and sold, determining if they had, in fact, come out ahead. This was wealth measured not in abstract currency, but in tangible improvements to their daily lives and security. The satisfaction of a good day was the weight of a full purse, but also the feel of sturdy new tools and the sight of essential supplies that would see them through the coming weeks. It was a quiet, personal reckoning with the day's fortune, a mixture of relief, satisfaction, or resolve to do better next time, as the last of the sunlight bled from the sky. But the closing of the market stalls did not mean the end of the day's business or social energy. It merely shifted its location. As the last carts rattled out of the square and the shadows merged into twilight, a new migration began, flowing from the cobblestone open air into the warm, smoky, and raucous interiors of the town's taverns and inns. These establishments, which had stood quiet and mostly empty during the daylight hours, now became the vibrant, beating heart of the community, transforming into hubs for everything the market had started but not finished: unofficial deal-making, the exchange of news too sensitive for public squares, and the kind of revelry that could only happen once the Lord's watchful officials had retired. The evening, the atmosphere inside was a world apart from the market's open-air chaos. The first thing that struck you was the thick, hazy air, heavy with the smell of wood smoke from a roaring hearth, spilled ale, roasting meat, and the mingled scent of damp wool and unwashed bodies that had been working hard all day. The light was dim and flickering, provided by rushlights dipped in animal fat or a few precious candles, casting dancing shadows on walls stained dark with decades of soot. The sound was a constant, solid roar of overlapping conversations, boisterous laughter, the clatter of wooden tankards, and the occasional burst of song from a corner where a minstrel was trying to earn his supper. After the visual spectacle of the market, the tavern offered an intimate, sensory immersion. For the wealthy merchant who had just brokered a major deal in the cloth hall, the finest inn offered a semi-private space to seal the agreement. Here, in a quiet booth or a rented upstairs room, the real negotiations could conclude away from prying eyes and ears. The formal haggling was over. Now was the time for building the relationship that would ensure future business. A bottle of good wine, far superior to the common ale served downstairs, would be shared. Contracts might be signed by a scribe hired for the occasion. Promises of future deliveries and exclusive deals were made over this shared cup. The convivial atmosphere softening the hard edges of commerce and forging bonds of trust that were as valuable as any written agreement. This was the medieval equivalent of a corporate dinner, where the social ritual was just as important as the transaction itself. Down in the common room of the humbler taverns, a different kind of economy was thriving. This was where the smaller traders and farmers who had done well would celebrate their success or console themselves over their losses. A peasant who had sold his pig for a good price might stand a round of drinks for his friends, his temporary generosity elevating his status for the night. The tavern was also the clearinghouse for the market's most valuable commodity: information. The gossip and rumors that had flown through the crowd in whispers now found a fertile ground to grow and spread. A traveler from the north might share alarming news of bandits on the road, causing traders to rethink their departure routes. A whispered conversation in a dark corner could reveal the infidelity of a prominent townsman, or the financial troubles of a local lord. Information that was social currency and could be traded for favors or influence. For the women of the market, the tavern offered a complex social space. While often dominated by men, the alewife who owned or ran the establishment was a figure of significant authority. She was a businesswoman in her own right, managing the complex logistics of brewing, serving, and maintaining order, often with just the help of her family. For other women, the tavern could be a place of sanctioned socializing, or it could be a place of work. Some assisted their husbands in running a stall, and now shared a well-earned drink. Others might find less savory but economically necessary work. Their presence a reminder of the stark realities and limited options that existed at the edges of society. And underpinning it all was the alcohol itself, the great social leveler. In the tavern, the rigid hierarchies of the daylight world could blur. A free peasant, emboldened by a few tankards of strong ale, might clap a wealthy merchant on the back and offer him advice. A group of apprentices, enjoying their one night of freedom, could laugh and joke with a gravity normally reserved for their masters. The shared experience of drink created a temporary, fragile camaraderie that crossed class lines. Of course, this same alcohol could also fuel arguments that the market's tensions had only thinly suppressed. A disputed bargain from hours before could reignite into a shouting match, and the crowded, heated environment meant that a spilled drink or a perceived insult could quickly escalate into a full-blown brawl, requiring the tavern keeper or her burly assistants to restore order with a firm hand and the threat of ejection into the cold street. As the night wore on and the ale and wine continued to flow, the tavern became a place of pure, unvarnished humanity. It was a stage for joy, sorrow, friendship, betrayal, ambition, and despair. Songs grew louder and more slurred, stories became more outlandish, and guards came down. In this warm, noisy, chaotic space, the community processed the day's events, celebrated its small victories, mourned its losses, and fortified itself for the week of hard work to come. The market square was the mind of the town, a place of calculation and exchange, but the tavern, as it hummed late into the night, was its wild, beating heart. But the true legacy of these weekly gatherings is not just in the stones of old town squares or romanticized festival reenactments. It is woven into the very DNA of our modern global economy. The chaotic, vibrant medieval market was, in fact, a powerful incubator for the sophisticated financial systems and commercial practices we take for granted today. A testing ground where the foundational concepts of our economic world were first forged in the fires of necessity and human ingenuity. Consider the humble money changer, perched at his table with his precision scales and touchstone, surrounded by a bewildering array of foreign coins. This figure was far more than a simple currency exchanger. He was the proto-banker, the essential lubricant for the engine of international trade. His need to assess, value, and store the wealth of traveling merchants created the very bedrock of modern finance. To avoid the immense risk and hassle of transporting heavy chests of silver and gold over dangerous roads, these money changers began to issue letters of credit. A merchant from Genoa could deposit his earnings with a trusted money changer in London and receive a carefully coded letter. He could then present this letter to the money changer's business partner or correspondent in, say, Frankfurt, and receive the equivalent value in local currency. This system of bills of exchange and promissory notes was the direct ancestor of the modern check, the wire transfer, and the entire concept of fractional reserve banking, where money becomes not just a physical object, but a trusted abstraction that can move across continents at the speed of a horse. This environment of risk and reward also gave birth to the earliest forms of insurance. The journey for a merchant was fraught with perils. Shipwrecks could send a fortune in spices to the bottom of the sea. Bandits could ambush a wagon train of Flemish cloth. or a fire could consume a warehouse full of goods just before a market day. To mitigate these devastating losses, merchants began to form informal mutual protection agreements. They would pool money into a common fund, and if one member suffered a catastrophic loss, the group would collectively cover it, ensuring that no single trader was completely wiped out by misfortune. These early guild-based insurance schemes, formalized in places like Lombardy in northern Italy, evolved into the sophisticated marine insurance contracts that enabled the age of exploration and ultimately blossomed into the global insurance industry that now underpins everything from international shipping to our own home and health coverage. The market structure itself is the clear forerunner of our modern retail landscape. The deliberate zoning of the medieval square, with luxury goods at the center, everyday necessities along the main thoroughfares, and livestock on the outskirts, established the fundamental principles of commercial real estate and consumer psychology that still dictate how we shop today. The vibrant, mixed-use environment of a market, where one could buy a loaf of bread, have a knife sharpened, watch a show, and meet friends, is the ancient blueprint for the modern shopping mall, the pedestrianized high street, and the festival marketplace. The medieval understanding that commerce thrives on experience, convenience, and spectacle is the same logic used by today's most successful retailers and urban planners. Most profoundly, the medieval market established the very idea of a regulated, trusted commercial space. The Lord's Charter, which guaranteed peace and standardized measurements, was a primitive but powerful form of consumer protection law and commercial licensing. It created a bubble of enforced fairness where business could be conducted with a degree of confidence, a concept that evolved into the complex legal frameworks of modern contract law, regulatory bodies, and consumer rights agencies. The market's role as an information hub, where news from across the region and beyond was gathered and disseminated, prefigured the function of the stock ticker, the financial news service, and the internet itself, proving that the flow of information is just as critical to commerce as the flow of goods. Every time we use a credit card, file an insurance claim, or simply enjoy a day of shopping in a bustling city center, we are participating in a world whose roots stretch back directly through the centuries, to the muddy, noisy, and astonishingly innovative world of the medieval market day. Now that we've walked through the astonishing reality of the market day, it's time to clear away the cobwebs of fantasy and confront the way this world is often shown to us on screen. Hollywood has given us a very specific, and often deeply misleading, vision of the medieval marketplace, a vision more concerned with romantic storytelling than historical truth. Let's pull back that glamorous curtain and separate the compelling fiction from the far more fascinating fact. First and foremost, let's talk about the most pervasive and fragrant myth of all: cleanliness. Films love to show us pristine cobblestone streets, with well-dressed peasants strolling past tidy stalls under a bright, clean sky. The reality was a full frontal assault on the senses, starting with the ground beneath your feet. Forget spotless stones. You were walking on a churned-up slurry of mud, straw, rotting vegetable matter, and a generous layer of animal dung from the hundreds of livestock being driven to and from the pens. There were no public sanitation crews, no drainage systems. When it rained, the entire square became a swampy quagmire that would suck the shoes right off your feet. And the smell, oh, the smell. This wasn't a faint, rustic aroma. It was a potent, layered, and inescapable wall of odor. The sharp tang of urine from the tannery stalls, the pungent reek of the fishmonger's catch baking in the sun, the heavy musk of unwashed bodies and wool cloaks damp with sweat and rain, all underpinned by the ever-present, earthy scent of manure. The medieval market was a dirty, messy, and overwhelmingly smelly place, a fact that cinema consistently washes away in favor of a more picturesque, and far less accurate visual palette. Then there's the fantasy of availability. How many times have you seen a movie character stroll up to a random stall and casually purchase a pineapple, a sack of oranges, or some other exotic fruit in the middle of England? This is perhaps the most egregious error. The range of goods was severely limited by season and by geography. The average person's diet and shopping were intensely local. You bought what was in season and what was produced within a very small radius. Yes, a wealthy merchant in the cloth hall could buy pepper that had crossed continents. But for the vast majority of people, the idea of having a banana, or even something as simple as a potato, a New World crop that didn't arrive until centuries later, was pure science fiction. The market was a reflection of hyper-localized production, not a global supermarket. You'd find apples in autumn, fresh greens in spring, and preserved foods like salted meat, hard cheese, and grain staples in the winter. The incredible variety we see on screen, with every imaginable good available at once, creates a false impression of abundance that simply didn't exist for 99% of the population. And what about the people themselves? Hollywood costuming departments often dress extras in a riot of earthy tones, practical leathers, and surprisingly clean, well-fitted garments. The historical truth was a story of fabric and class, written in what people wore. While the nobility and wealthy merchants did wear rich, colorful clothes dyed with expensive pigments, the common folk, the farmers, the laborers, the vast majority of the crowd, were dressed in layers of practicality, not palette-coordinated style. Their clothing was made from rough, undyed wool, or a homespun blend of flax and wool called linsey woolsey, which naturally ranged in color from grayish-brown to a creamy off-white. These were work clothes, worn and patched, often passed down through a family. The idea of a peasant woman in a vibrant, clean red dress is almost laughable. That color came from the rare and precious Kermes insect, or madder root, and the dress would have been a huge financial investment, certainly not worn to get jostled in a muddy market crowd. Costumes in film are designed to help us distinguish characters at a glance. Medieval clothing was a walking billboard of your social rank and economic reality. And for most, it was a billboard written in shades of brown and gray. Finally, we have the myth of constant, chaotic violence. Many a swashbuckling film uses the market as a backdrop for a dramatic sword fight, with produce carts overturned and chickens scattering as our hero duels the villain. While brawls certainly happened, especially as the taverns filled up later in the day, the sanctioned market was one of the most heavily regulated and pacified spaces in medieval life. The entire event operated under the king's or lord's peace, a legal force field that promised severe, immediate punishment for violent crime. The prominent placement of the stocks and pillory in the square was a constant, grim reminder of the consequences. Drawing a weapon to settle a dispute wasn't a thrilling climax. It was a fast track to a public shaming, a heavy fine, imprisonment, or worse. The market's officials and the lord's bailiffs were everywhere, their job to maintain order so commerce could flow. Disputes were far more likely to be settled with loud, spirited haggling and an appeal to the bailiff's court than with a flash of steel. The real drama of the market wasn't in clashing swords, but in clashing wits, in the high-stakes negotiation over the price of a cow, and in the complex social maneuvering that occurred in a rare space where all levels of society were forced to interact. So as the last carts rumble away and the final echoes of the market bell fade, what are we left with? We're not just left with the memory of a busy day of shopping. We're left with the blueprint of an entire civilization. The medieval market day was far more than an event. It was a perfect, bustling microcosm of the entire medieval world. a living model where every strand of society, economic, social, judicial, and sensory, was woven together into a single vibrant tapestry. Economically, it was the engine of the age. It was a globalized trading floor and a local farmers' market operating side by side, a place where the abstract concept of economy became tangible. You could see it in the money changers' scales, weighing silver from a dozen different kingdoms. You could hear it in the rapid fire haggling over the price of a pig, a transaction that could make or break a family's entire year. This was where capital flowed, futures were decided, and the very idea of international finance was born in the ledgers of wool merchants and the promises of letters of credit. Socially, it was the great leveler and the great reinforcer. For a few precious hours, the rigid feudal pyramid was compressed into a single, teeming square. A lord's steward might jostle with a freed serf. A priest might bargain with a brewer's wife. It was one of the only sanctioned spaces where such interactions could happen, offering a rare glimpse across the class divide. Yet, at the same time, the strict zoning of the market, with fine cloth at the center and noisy livestock on the edges, constantly reminded everyone of their designated place in the world. It was a controlled experiment in social freedom, a pressure valve that actually helped to maintain the overall structure of society by offering a temporary, supervised release. Judicially, it was a stage for power and morality. The market was a bubble of enforced order, a demonstration of the Lord's ability to keep the peace and guarantee fairness under his banner. The prominent stocks and pillory were not hidden away. They were central features, a stark warning that the community's trust was the highest law. The ale conner performing his unique test, and the bread wearer with his official scales were walking symbols of a commitment to justice, however rough it may seem to us now. This public display of regulation was essential for commerce to function, proving that trust is the one currency every economy, ancient or modern, depends upon most. And sensorially, it was an overwhelming immersion. This was not a clean, quiet, polite affair. It was a full-body experience that would overwhelm a modern person. The smell alone was a complex story wood smoke and honey cakes, fighting with the pungent truth of tanneries and livestock. The sounds were a roaring symphony of animal panic, shouted negotiations, ringing hammers, and minstrel songs all competing for air. To walk through the market was to be bombarded with the raw, unfiltered data of medieval life, a cacophony of existence that was dirty, demanding, and vibrantly, unforgettably real. The incredible thing is, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of this world today. That familiar feeling of a bustling Saturday farmers market, the specific energy of a holiday craft fair, even the deliberate layout of a modern shopping mall with its food court and anchor stores. These are all direct descendants of the medieval market square. The next time you walk through your own town center, try to picture it. Imagine the half-timbered stalls lining the streets, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and forges, the sound of a livestock auction where the parking lot now stands. That space was once the absolute heart of everything the internet, the newspaper, and the stock exchange of its day. We've journeyed together through the entire arc of this astonishing institution, from the anxious preparations the night before to the raucous tavern celebrations long after the last bell. But I'm deeply curious to know which part of this world resonated most with you. Was it the complex social dance that happened in the crowd, the intricate, almost magical work of the apothecary, or perhaps the sheer innovation of the financial systems born from the money changer's table? Share your thoughts down in the comments. Let me know which aspect of the medieval market day captured your imagination. I read every